What's up, heathens? How ya doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Tonight, we're going over something that we haven't touched in a little bit, and that something is evolution. So tonight, we're going to be going over this one channel called Reasons for Hope, and they have put together a number of debunked videos. These videos supposedly debunk a number of, I guess, arguments against the theistic or specifically Christian position. And one of those particular arguments is obviously evolution, or at least they think that evolution is an argument against their faith. They take up the mantle of trying to disprove evolution. And so this video tonight is about how fossils, specifically the fossil record, doesn't prove evolution. If you want to fuck around and find out how the fossil record definitely does prove that evolution is a fact, then please stay tuned. Okay, so to preface, right, this video has already been covered by a much more knowledgeable person, Forrest Valkai. If you guys don't know, Forrest is a host on The Line, and, you know, I don't know him all that well, but he seems like a really great guy, and he did a pretty good job refuting this video, but because his following is so large, the Reasons for Hope guys decided to jump on his coattails and respond to his criticisms of their content. So I've worked in some of the standard responses that are usually given that Reasons for Hope gave in response to Forrest's stuff. And I mean, Forrest's responses are pretty similar to mine. I mean, it didn't really affect my knowledge of what's being said, other than, you know, Forrest did do the legwork and figuring some of the misquote the quotations out that are wrong, and they go through a lot of trouble to try to reclaim the quotes, which we'll cover here in a minute. If you want to see Forrest's perspective, definitely look up Forrest and this fossil evidence, or fossils don't prove evolution. I'll try to have a link in the description after the live stream tonight, but it's a pretty good video. Tonight, we've got Reasons for Hope, who's going to be demonstrating that the fossil record doesn't prove that evolution is a fact. And they're only going to be using the best that creationist apologetics has, which is not that good, but I feel like it's the only arguments that they can really make about the fossil record, and these guys are pretty much going to make them. So let's get on into the video, shall we? You ready for the video there, honey?
We've unearthed millions of fossils around the world, so with all this evidence, so to speak, it's clear that the fossil record proves evolution, right? Well, actually, no. Didn't when Darwin was alive, and hasn't since he's been gone. In fact, Chucky D himself knew this when he wrote the following: geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this, perhaps, is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. The explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geological record. Okay.
So I stopped it right here because obviously I feel like it's a basic rule of apologetics, especially creationism, to quote things out of context. And that's exactly what's happened here. Now, in the response video to this, they had a bit of a problem with Forrest pointing out that in the very bottom right there, I don't know if you guys can see it, but it's got like a citation, right? This citation is wrong if you actually buy On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. You can go to Amazon and get it. I went to Amazon and I bought it, and just to, you know, to do my own fact checking about it, because down there in the bottom it says in chapter 10, right? It's not in chapter 10, it's actually in chapter 9. Now, in the response, they point out how their particular copy of On the Origin of Species has it in chapter 10, not chapter 9. They also further quote some of Charles Darwin's stuff like surrounding this passage, and it has totally different words than what appears in on the Origin of Species. So I'm not exactly sure what copy they have. Like, I don't know if it's like some kind of like apologist abbreviated copy or something. I don't know, but obviously there's something fucky going on with, you know, their citation down there, but also they're misunderstanding what Charles Darwin is saying. And not only have they taken him out of context, the context in which he brings this up in is very important, because what he's saying is he's discussing the pushback that could be levied against his idea. And one of the pushbacks, which he says is a valid pushback, which is a tough pushback, is the fact that at the time in which Darwin was writing this, the fossil record was not as completed as it is now. Like, they didn't have as many fossils. They didn't understand a lot about fossils, or as far as like the breadth of the fossil record. They didn't understand a lot. So obviously the fossil record at the time didn't support evolution. But what Charles Darwin was able to do is to hypothesize that any fossils that are found in the future would only support this idea of evolution. In whatever way evolution actually took place, you will definitely see relationships between these fossils, and that these fossils can be grouped either morphologically or by other traits that each of these fossils have. There's a whole field of science that deals with organizing, the species and into clades and all this other stuff. So at the time that he was writing this, obviously the fossil record did not support him, like as far as the fossils that they had. It didn't support evolution, because we didn't have as many fossils as we do now. Well, this does not fucking affect the guys over at Reasons for Hope. They have an argument against that. But the important thing to know here is that this is taken out of context. They're being anachronistic and importing their idea of the full breadth of the fossil record into this time, because they're making it sound like Darwin knew how many fossils we'd find or how many fossils there are and the connections between the fossils, and yet he still said this. That's just simply not true, and it feels like they're just taking this quote out of time and place.
Is there a problem with using that quote to say that there's no evidence in the fossil record to prove evolution? And I say no, there's not.
Right, and of course this guy wouldn't. So this is obviously after after Forrest responded to him. So he's trying to make an argument against Forrest, who made the exact same argument. He says, no, there's no problem with using this quote, but there is a problem with using this quote, because at the time, the fossil record didn't support evolution as far as the fossil record being proof of evolution, right? But now the fossil record, we have a more complete picture of it, not complete, but we have a clearer view of the fossil record now than obviously we had in the late 1800s. You can't use the quote to say that there's no evidence in the fossil record for evolution now. That's being anachronistic. You're taking Darwin out of time and place, and you're using Darwin to prove something that Darwin didn't even consider, know about, or write about. So yes, this is a disingenuous use of Darwin.
That quote absolutely supports what we made the claim, is that the fossil record proves evolution debunked. No, it does not.
Yeah.
Darwin knew it. And guess what? People today know it as well.
You can't say that Darwin knew it. Darwin didn't know the kinds of fossils that we'd find. He didn't know what fossils existed. What he did was he provided a hypothesis that the fossil record would fall in line with the idea of evolution, that further discoveries of fossils would only further support evolutionary theory. And we've actually been able to use evolutionary theory in order to predict where to find fossils. So because the fossils exist and the fossil record corresponds to this idea of evolution, because evolution's a fact, that means that we can use evolution to figure out where we should find certain fossils. That's how we found Tiktaalik. We were able to predict where we would find Tiktaalik, and what kind of conditions in the ancient earth would need to be present for Tiktaalik to thrive in its environment, where that environment would be. And so we've been able to use all of these different hypotheses in order to find certain fossils. To say that the fossil record now is disproven by Charles Darwin's statement, like, oh fuck, what was it, 200, we're working on the latter half of 200 years ago, like, that's just insane. You can't use that as evidence. I know that they want to, but you can't.
But surely after all the time since Darwin, digging and discovering fossil after fossil, we have a more perfect geological record that supports evolution, right? Not even close, bud.
But the thing is that the fossil record that we've been able to put together has only further supported evolution. And this is recognized by, paleontologists, biologists, like everybody recognizes the benefit of having a fossil record and what the fossil record points us to. Now, as far as the finer aspects of like, well, how did organisms evolve? What were the mechanisms involved in this evolution? How exactly did these species deviate and all this other stuff? Those are the kinds of discussions that are being had. Apologists like this like to take, and I guess I'm speaking about the further, the stuff that I wasn't able to cut into this video that they discuss in their review of Forrest's video. They take more people out of context and they try to say, oh, well, look, these scientists, they agree with us that the fossil record doesn't prove evolution. And that's just simply not true, because we have several more pieces of evidence outside of the fossil record to prove that evolution is true. But evolution can, for one thing, the fossil record supports the idea of evolution, but also we can use the idea of evolution to predict what we should find in the gaps of our knowledge of the fossil record. And you know what the funny thing is that this relationship that the fossil record has with evolution, which is what we should expect to find if evolution is a fact, which it is, we're able to use evolution to predict what fossils we're going to find. And then you know what happens?
What happens?
We find the fucking fossils! It's happened with Tiktaalik. It's happened with multiple other fossils. We've been able to use evolution to prove what fossils, or well, no, not prove, but to hypothesize what kind of fossils should we find here. And you know what? Fuck it if we don't find those fossils. So this is a tightly coupled like dependency there, because evolution is a fact.
Even back then, let's say there were no fossils. Okay, well then he has no evidence at all. Zero. He has none now. Actually, the evidence now shows that there wasn't gradual modification along the way. But I don't get that point. So, and
yeah,
so
even
the
if we
next
didn't have
point would
fossils
be,
then, even if we didn't have fossils then, we still know that it's true because we know that evolution is true, and that's a point that we'll get to in the future. But
because of the fossil record that we don't have any evidence for because there's no fossils. No.
They're trying to make it sound circular, right? But in actuality, the fossil record supporting the idea of evolution comes from the fact that we find these fossils of organisms that seem to share traits. And evolution can clue us into, you know, how those species deviated, or what, like, we can use evolution to hypothesize, well, if this group has this trait and this group has that trait, then we should find a previous ancestor that should have like either both traits or some kind of mix of both traits, or however, whatever trait we're talking about. Like we should see a progenitor of that trait, like something that precedes that, right? And so we can use evolution to hypothesize what should be there. And because we do find it, that further reinforces that evolution has a is a predictive model, which is one of the key characteristics of scientific theories. Well, it's not circular like they're trying to make it out to be. It's just that with us finding fossils, consistently finding fossils throughout time, it's only further reinforced the explanatory and predictive nature of evolution. And that's how it supports evolution.
Listen to how two renowned evolutionary biologists summarize the truth. Instead of finding the slow, smooth, and progressive changes, they saw in the fossil record rapid bursts of change, new species appearing seemingly out of nowhere and then remaining unchanged for millions of years, patterns hauntingly reminiscent of creation.
Well, yes, because once you identify a species, then that species is that species. When a species starts to change and they start exhibiting new traits, we find that this species is somewhat like this species, then we know that this species branched off of that original species. So for him to say, oh, well, this species started to exist here and then they remained unchanged. There was a group of organisms that pretty much stayed the same as far as being the same species. Sure, the species started to exist and they continued on existing until they existed no more. Does that mean that there was no change? That there was no change that was experienced? That there were no branches that came off of that species that changed a little bit into a different species? No. That's the basic assumption that they're making here, is that once there's a species, there is a species, and that, yeah, there's this other species that pops up chronologically after the first species, and it looks a lot like that original species, but morphologically, it's somewhat different. They have different traits about it and everything like that, enough to say that it's a different species. So obviously, they have nothing to do with one another. That's the assumption that they're making here, and that's just a bullshit assumption. It's a bullshit assumption to assume that one species exists and it has no relation to other animals. They need to prove that, which they can't. Populations of animals change over time. And sure, once a species is a species, it stays that species for the entire span of that population's existence, that particular species' existence. They will always be that species. But that doesn't mean that their population doesn't change and become some different population.
The fossil record doesn't show gradual change, and every paleontologist has known that ever since Cuvier, or however you pronounce that.
Well, so this is, I highly suggest people go and watch Forrest's video, because he dives deep into the quotations that are used and how ridiculous it is, because these guys, they literally go to this, they misattribute things, for one, as we've already seen, but also they use a guy that's been trained in engineering technology who claims to know more than evolutionary biologists. And he goes on like creationist shows like Eric Coven's show, and I don't know who else. I think he was just on like the Creation Today show. I believe it was with Eric Coven. But they basically got a guy not trained in evolutionary biology, has made a career out of going against the grain of evolutionary biologists. Normally, I don't pull out the like authority card, but I kind of feel like in order to do that, you would need at least a background in evolutionary biology of some kind. And he doesn't have that. But anyways, definitely suggest looking at Forrest's video. I'll have it linked in the description after the show tonight, but definitely check that out for a more in-depth analysis of these quotes that they use, because they're definitely quoting either out of context or they're misattributing the sources of the quote.
Yeah, I think when you simplify things and say it just needs to change over time, everybody goes, oh, I guess that makes sense. But when you actually start thinking about all the mechanisms that need to change, the blueprints that need to change to make the things, the structure's got to change, everything's got to change, and you can't just go, well, it just did it. You have to actually show some kind of evidence, some kind of evidence that can even happen.
This is interesting to hear them say this, because evolutionary biologists have done this. Just giving you one example here that's pretty prominent is proving that birds developed from reptiles. And just one particular aspect of this is feathers, right? How did feathers evolve? And well, it turns out that we can genetically alter the DNA of like crocodiles and other reptilians, specifically crocodiles in this situation, but they specifically altered a crocodile embryo's DNA to where instead of scales, it produced like prehistoric feathers. So feathers originally started out as these sort of like your own like hair, but like spikier. We'll see that as feathers evolve over time, we see them getting bushier, and like they have the stuff coming off the sides of them. The point is that the experiment that was done that changed the DNA of the scales on the crocodile to turn into feathers, there was a change that was noticed, and they turned into prehistoric feathers that were basically kind of like needles, but at the same time, that's how feathers started out, and we have evidence of that in the fossil record. I'm sure our neighbors really appreciate me right now. These guys are sitting here and they're saying, oh, this hasn't been done. Scientists haven't done this. They have to prove this thing. But scientists have done this. They have proven it. They have done the lab work for it. They have shown that it's true. It's just that these guys don't care to go to Google fucking Scholar, or they don't understand. That's a good point. There's multiple avenues to explain their ignorance on this, but I feel like all they would have to do is go to Google Scholar and type in like, how did feathers evolve, or what science experiments have been done to prove this particular aspect of evolution. That's all they have to do, but they refuse to do it. And I fucking hate it when people refuse to read the source fucking material, as you all should know by now.
I mean, so to have
and the
20,000 changes based on mutations.
And think about it. The point that he made, even if you give them the millions of years there's still not enough time for all of those things to take place. And that's undirected. That's with no intelligence involved at all.
Exactly.
So this is a common talking point from creationists, is that there's not enough time for all the genetic changes to happen in order for evolution to happen. And they go through this whole long thing where they show this video, this bullshit video about how whales couldn't have evolved from land quadrupeds. It's a total bullshit video that tries to lay out how there's not enough time for the genetic changes to happen. What they fail to understand is that multiple changes can occur in an organism in a short geologic period of time, like 100,000 years or something like that, which would be short for a geologic time frame. So you can have a lot of mutations that happen in parallel with each other that shrink that required amount of time. But in order to make it sound like there's not enough time, they only have to consider things sequentially. They only consider certain mutations in a sequential manner. Like, oh, well, first this has to develop, and then this has to develop, and then this has to develop. It takes all that time in order for these things to happen, and so there's not enough time. When in reality, things can happen in parallel, and they often do. One organism can develop one trait while another organism develops another trait, and then when they mate or their groups mate, they can merge all of those changes like a fucking GitHub branch, and they can have an updated genetic code and shit.
Okay, I could go on, but there's always going to be opposing views because on both sides of the debate, the same evidence is interpreted through different worldviews. You got to remember that, people. Facts don't say anything. People say things based on their interpretation of facts, influenced by their worldview.
I do agree that we have our own interpretations of facts, or well, there are the facts and then there's our interpretation of it. But I feel like in this particular situation, these are not the same thing for the creationist view versus a naturalistic point of view. Because the naturalistic point of view has evidence. We have natural processes that explain all of this. We have the explanatory power. And you know how the creationists attain all this explanatory power and how they explain everything? Oh, I'm sorry, a fucking wizard did it all! And that's their explanation for it. These are not the same thing here. I get that we have our own interpretation of the facts, and we have our own ways of putting these facts together to argue for some particular point, and that those are affected by our biases and all this other stuff. But people have to forego this entire notion that the creationist side and the naturalist side are on the same fucking level. We're not. They're proposing a magical sky wizard decided to create all of life and created all the diversity magically out of fucking nothing. And that's their explanation for everything. They can't explain the changes in species. They can't explain the fossil record as we have it. They can't explain a plethora of things in science and history, biology, every single field of science. They have a problem with explaining shit, but they solve it. They put a little band-aid on it by saying, oh, a fucking magical wizard did it. Don't worry about it. The whole fact that they propose this magical being that exists outside of space and time just really pisses me off, because it's like I'm sitting over here combing through Google Scholar trying to figure out, like, here I am minutes before the stream Googling how in the fuck does sexual reproduction evolve? And I'm sitting there having to speed read through a scientific article figuring out like the entire history of sexual reproduction, how it evolves in a species, the drawbacks and the pros and the cons of it and all this other stuff. And what do they get to do? Oh, my magical wizard in the sky cast an incantation that created everything, and that's how I explain stuff. It's a bit aggravating. These are not the same things. These are not comparable things.
That's a whole other subject, and I don't want to get into it right now. Instead, hey, let's have a little fun and take a look at some popular secular articles and charts on the fossil record and see if we can learn to separate facts from interpretation of facts by asking a few simple questions. Question 1. Did the artiste take any artistic license with what I'm looking at here?
Just to put this in perspective here, I have a picture from the Ark Encounter where even Ken Ham is saying, hey, we've taken artistic license with the representations in this entire fucking museum. Damn! Don't give me this shit about an artist representing Australopithecus in a forest when we couldn't have had a picture of Australopithecus in a forest, and so we have to use our best guess as to what that would fucking look like. Yes, there is quote-unquote artistic license in that we didn't actually have a picture of Australopithecus going through the forest or anything like that. What we do have is fossil evidence that shows us what their faces would have looked like. We have fossil evidence for, you know, them walking upright. There's multiple different points of evidence in their skeletal structure that points that out. The placement of the vertebra on their skull, their knees have a dead giveaway that they walked upright. Their pelvis, how that was shaped, is a dead giveaway for it. We could also, gauge how tall they were, how muscular they were, and all that. Like, has this motherfucker never seen the show Bones? Because, like, in the show Bones, she diagnosed somebody with tendinitis just by looking at the fucking joint on the fucking skeleton. And you think that we can't figure shit out, basic shit out enough to paint a picture? Like, what the fuck? See, this is why they don't respond to me.
Check this out, because this happens all the time. Look, isn't that sweet? So cute and fluffy. Okay, why do you think the artist made these creatures appear more human-like by throwing in an affectionate smile and depicting them hanging out like a human family going to a picnic or something?
This is another big problem with creationists, and this is something that Forrest brings up too, is that the creationists often think that, like, humans are special in that we're apparently the only species that can smile, but also we're apes. We're still apes. We're part of the great ape family. So yes, apes can smile. These apes would have smiled too. Having them smile is not something that's like an out there thing. It's not like they're trying to suggest that the one Australopithecus is psychically transmitting information to the other one or something. It's not something crazy like that. Also, why are they depicted as though they're a family? Well, probably because they were probably part of a group of multiple families, but they were all one community that was moving through the woods together. At least the apes that we evolved from would have been social creatures, or at least starting to be social creatures. So obviously we moved in packs. Like, this is not something new. This is something known.
Why did he draw them walking upright?
As I explained before, there's multiple data points and skeletal structures alone that we have from the Australopithecus that show that they most likely walked upright and that they regularly walked upright.
Why make the shapes and colors of their eyes more human than ape?
Well, through the analysis of skulls that we've been able to find of Australopithecus, we've been able to figure out the shape of the eye. But also, at some point, apes developed like whites in their eyes, right? At some point that developed. And it was probably socially beneficial and beneficial for group cohesion for the whites to develop and all this other stuff. Like, there was obviously some evolutionary beneficial trait for that. The whole notion that they've made these apes look more human than ape is a nonsensical statement. Like, that's just a nonsensical way to round out that sentence, because humans are apes. So we're part of the great ape family. This makes no sense. We are still apes. So it's not that we're making them look more human. It's just that we're still apes. So that's why they seem to be progressing in our direction, because they're still apes. We're still apes. We're all apes.
Is any of it based on actual fossil evidence? Of course not.
Of course not. This is how you can tell somebody hasn't read up on the actual scholarship surrounding these fossils. Because if they had, they would have found like the skeletal analysis that shows that they walked upright. You could also figure out like what kind of foods they ate, when they started eating cooked meat. At what point did a larger brain start to develop? And specifically, Australopithecus answered one vital question for us, and that's exactly when did we start walking upright? Was it before our brains grew larger, or was it after we gained larger brains? And the Australopithecus, the brain cavity seems to suggest that we started walking upright before our brain started to increase in size. That they're just simply not reading up on the scholarship. And it's very frustrating to have somebody be like, oh, no, there's no evidence for this, when a basic Google search can show you that you're wrong.
But if you want the story of evolution to appear more convincing, you just might fill in missing gaps with your presuppositional imagination. Just saying.
We don't fill in the gaps with our presuppositional assumptions or anything like that. Like, there's a difference, because his insinuation here is that these are ad hoc assumptions that we're making about either Australopithecus or these other transitional forms. And the thing is that we're not being ad hoc about it. We have good reasons for making these assumptions. We have evidenced reasons for making these assumptions. So just saying that, oh, they fill it in with these ad hoc presuppositions that they have is not representative of the actual scientific data, because we have good reasons for making certain assumptions. And if further fossil information or further genetic or further argumentation proves that, oh, no, it wasn't this way, it was another way, then we just change, the hypothesis or our particular view of things. And that, because that's how science works. If we have better information, then we change our hypotheses about the evidence. But I mean, that's just, again, how science works.
Question 2. Is the attention-grabbing headline or title supported by actual facts? For instance, take a look at this popular book called Why Evolution is True. We don't even have to go any further than the jacket on this one, because on it you got a dino evolving into a bird in 3 simple steps. There you go. But then on the inside, this is written, and I kid you not. The jacket depicts a chronological sequence of fossils showing the evolution of birds. We do not know whether the actual line of descent included, now wait for it, the first 3.
Well, so, I mean, obviously that's just the jacket. And that's just the cover. My guess is that they were wanting to visually depict that reptiles evolved into birds, which we have fossil evidence for, but more than that, we have other kinds of evidence that suggest this kind of descent. Whether or not those first 3 that's on the jacket are in the exact line of lineage for that particular bird is what's in question here. Like, that's why it says whether the actual line of descent included the first 3 on the cover. So, like, that's up in the air, but there's no question about the fact that reptiles evolved into birds.
Say what now? Doesn't that mean these 3 shouldn't be on the cover then?
No, it doesn't mean that those 3 shouldn't be on the cover. It's just being honest about our knowledge about specific lines of evolution. Like, we can't say for sure that those 3 species are in that particular evolutionary line for that particular bird. But what we can say is that reptiles slowly evolved into what we have now as birds.
Which means all you got is a modern bird, right? No evolution, just a bird.
No, not a modern, I mean, obviously, the end product there is a modern bird, but even in the past, a few million years, since the dinosaurs were wiped out, you have various different evolutionary lines for birds. They've changed. They've always changed. He just acts like, oh, this modern bird existed back in the time of the dinosaurs. Like, that's what he's trying to insinuate here, is that this bird has just always existed. That's just not true.
About worldview filling in gaps, on to question 3. What do the graphics on evolutionary charts indicate? I mean, they sure do look convincing. For instance, on this one from the dinosaur book, you got solid red columns and white columns showing gradual progression over time. But let's read the almost imperceptible 2-point font over here. It reads, tinted areas indicate solid fossil evidence, which means the white areas represent no solid fossil evidence, right?
Well, saying no solid fossil evidence kind of gives it this air of, oh, these fossils don't exist. And that's not exactly true, but also, we're not given any kind of real information about what fossils this is even representing. I feel like this right here is just to show how species change over time, how species are interconnected, and how, you can start with one species of animal and it diversifies into several different lines, several different kinds of species. To say no solid fossil evidence, I mean, we don't even know what fossil evidence we're talking about, but what we can say for sure, if you just look down here in the bottom that's showing, right here, this little area, I'm not a weatherman. You can tell I wasn't a weatherman. Let me see if I can point to it. This guy right here, right? We just look at that. You could see what fossil evidence that we have. Now, it's pretty easy to see the commonalities in the morphological nature of these animals. So we can obviously tell that multiple of these animals are related to a ancestor that we don't have fossil evidence for. We have not so good fossil evidence for, but we can tell that they're all related because of the traits that they exhibit. And so we can make further arguments for like some of these earlier ones because of what layer they were found in the geologic column and everything like that. We can know that they came first. They branched off first from this original, but this original species line further diversified later on into all these different versions of itself. And this is all identified through similar traits that are exhibited in the fossils. What he's expecting or what he's requiring is literal physical evidence of every minute change. But we're not going to find that. Fossils are incredibly hard to create, and for them to naturally form is even harder. To expect every minute change to be represented in the fossil record is unreasonable. What we expect to find are certain species showing up. Those certain species exhibit certain traits that we can lump together in different clades, and we can group together by the traits that they exhibit. And that's how we can group them, just like is on the screen here. And that's how all of these graphics are designed. That's basically this cladistics sort of view here. That's what that entire field is grouping organisms by traits. But he's expecting to find every single minute change in an organism, and that's just not going to happen.
Okay, then take them away. Uh-oh, looks like patterns hauntingly reminiscent of creation, I'd say, right?
No, this is not patterns reminiscent of creation, okay? For one thing, for it to be reminiscent of creation, you would need them to all be starting at the same time, because that's what creation is. It's not this slow, gradual development of different species and different species popping up at different times in the geological column. It's all of them being created at the exact same time. Every single one of those species should be found in the earliest, like 248 million years ago layer. They should all appear there, but they don't, because they evolved slowly over time.
From their own charts. And the same thing goes for the dotted lines on this one. Look at all of them. Just so we're clear, dotted lines indicate zero evidence. Remove them and what do you get? No transitional forms or evidence of gradual progression. A bat is a bat, a kangaroo is a kangaroo, and a horse is a horse.
So that's just not true. If we go back and we look at this, he's assuming that the dotted lines means that there's no evidence whatsoever to connect those creatures together. But there is evidence. There's evidence in shared traits and shared morphology. So we can lump them together by using, our best hypothesis about, the shared traits and how traits would have developed. We can make a solid argument for connecting those animals in that kind of way. But what he's saying here is that there's no evidence. There's no transitional forms. That's just not true. He went from saying no solid evidence to no evidence whatsoever. And this is something that Forrest pointed out as well. That is the sort of bait and switch that they play on you here, is that they're trying to make it seem like there's just no evidence for it. There's no reason to think that these animals are connected or they evolved in any kind of way, which is not true.
Of course, unless, of course, the horse is Mr. Ed. Look, people, all I'm saying here is
I fucking hate how they do their fucking videos.
If you got facts, put them in there. If you don't, leave them out.
Well, I mean, that's a little bit unfair for the graphics that they provided, because they're ripping the graphics out of context. Who's to say that the context didn't further explain the graph? Who's to say that the context doesn't further explain that, oh, well, there's no physical fossil evidence to make this connection. Like, we don't have every single minute change that occurred in this particular evolutionary line. We don't have that, but what we do have is a strong hypothesis to connect this animal to this animal, because there's no way that this animal exhibiting these traits can't be related to this animal exhibiting similar but slightly different traits. They're wanting you to think that that just simply doesn't exist. And I don't understand why somebody would be convinced by this.
Don't draw downright dubious, daft, dare I declare, dunderheaded dotted lines of deliberate deception dogmatically and dastardly doodle to disguise definitive data. No.
Yes, that was a lot of D to get through right there for a Christian video.
Just admit what you actually see. Overwhelming evidence of living things according to their kinds suddenly appearing.
Define kinds. That's all I ask. Define kinds. You got the facts on your side there, Broseph. Then why don't you define what a kind is? My guess is that they would define kind by morphologically unique. The kangaroo is morphologically unique when compared to a gorilla. But you know what? Kangaroos are marsupials, and there are other things that are marsupials as well. Could they be related in some kind of fashion? Probably. What he wants to do is say, hey, unless you have every single minute change between one organism connecting it to another organism, then you cannot say that those two organisms are related. But we know that that's not how biology works. Biology doesn't just automatically poof into existence because a magical wizard cast an incantation to create everything. Shit changes over time. Biological systems slowly change over time. And we also don't expect to have every single minute change. We expect to have the fossils that are the result of the natural processes that create fossils, which is incredibly rare compared to how many things have died in the past. Fossils are actually incredibly rare. But he wants to act like if I can't see it, then there's no good reason to believe any argument made for it. But considering all of the context surrounding biological systems, how they change and all that, we can make these kinds of inferences. We can solidly say this animal is related to that animal because of these reasons, because of these traits, because of this shared morphology that they have.
Which, as a reminder, is exactly what the Bible teaches. Now, I don't even have time to get into TV, movies, and documentaries. All I ask is that you use the same line of questioning when you watch them. And in summary, we agree with Mr. D. Geology surely does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain.
Again, using Charles Darwin out of context here, because obviously the fossil record at the time wasn't as complete as it is now, and therefore Charles Darwin couldn't have said that the fossil record supported evolution. But if Charles Darwin was alive now, I'm sure that he'd look at the fossil record and be like, aha, I was right, bitch. I'm sure Charles Darwin would say bitch.
Not then, not now, not ever. And that means the whole idea that the fossil record proves evolution has been debunked. Adios.
Well, heathens, is going to be it for his video tonight, or their video tonight. All in all, I wasn't convinced that the fossil record has been debunked as evidence for evolution. I believe that there's a deep coupling between the fossil evidence and the evolutionary hypothesis. I believe that the fossil evidence reinforces the explanatory power of the evolutionary scientific theory. The evolution scientific theory can help us predict what fossils we should be able to find and where and in what geologic column. So they do have a mutual connection. It's definitely not circular in the same fashion that they're wanting to represent it as. Also, they're willfully ignoring scientific evidence that's contrary to their position, and they seem to only want to ignore that evidence because either they don't understand it or they understand it and they know that it would be a problem for their case, or they just simply don't want to acknowledge it. It could be a product of cognitive dissonance. There's a lot of different issues that could explain why they're just not doing the very basics of any kind of research on the opposing position, and what in this case is the mainstream like consensus that's built on solid evidence is, kind of case here. You would think you would want to know what the actual mainstream case is, but they don't seem to know it. Let's see. Before we head out, I hope that you will go down below, leave us a comment with what you thought about either my responses to the debunked stuff or the debunked the reasons for hope staff. Well, let us know what you thought about their video down there in the comments. And while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.